Hello, dear friends. I changed my venue today because it's a hot day and there's better air conditioning in this room. The the parsha is Parshat Bamidbar of the book of Bamidbar, which is the first portion of the book of Numbers. In English, we call it Numbers. Literally, Bamidbar means in the desert, but the truth is there's also a Hebrew name for this book, which is also Chumash HaPkudim, which also means the Chumash of counting. Because, of course, at the beginning of this week's portion, the Israelite nation is counted. And altogether, all the Pkudim, from males from the ages of 20 to 60, come out to 600,000 and another 3,550. And then, of course, it adds that the Leviim, the Levites, the tribe of Levi, were not counted among this counting. So a few things we have to say about the counting. Number one is that there were much more than 600,000 because it's only the males from the ages of 20 to 60. Assuming females are normally at least the same amount of males and often a little bit even more sometimes. So that would mean at least 120,000. And again, those are only the ages from 20 to 60. So assuming they're also children, there might be people over 60. Of course, there's a question in the Midrash and the simple meaning of the text. And so we get to anywhere between 1.5 million, maybe even more than that. Maybe it's even closer to the 2 million count. You also have the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude. So definitely over 1.5 million people are in the Israelite camp. But we know also that in Jewish tradition, counting became something which was not to be done directly because people were not supposed to be considered as objects. Therefore, we see that King Saul says, "Vayifkedem mitlaim." The way he counts the people is everybody brings a sheep to the palace, and through this way, they are able to count how many people there are. In fact, it says that King David was punished for counting the people. And so basically, counting is usually something which is done indirectly to show that people are not numbers. It's also the idea of the blessing happens when upon things which are not countable. If you know, in this week's Haftorah, there's a quote from Hosea, who says, "Vayam mispar b'nei Israel k'chol hayam," that the amount of the people of Israel will be like the sands of the sea, shelo yimad v'lo yisafer, that cannot be counted and cannot be measured. Right? The sign of blessing is something which cannot be counted and cannot be measured. Now, there's something else interesting here, which happens in this parsha, and this is what I want to talk about, and that is the issue of the Bichorim, which means after the people are counted, we have a very strange story that the Bichorim, the firstborn of the people of Israel, are after the Levim are counted. Levim are 22,000 people. So the firstborn of Israel are redeemed by the Levim. This we find in chapter 3, verse 40. Right? Kod kol bechor zachar. You have to count every one of the firstborn males from 1 month and above. And then take the Levim, take the Levites, instead of each one of these Bechorim, these firstborn. And even the animals, the cattle of the Levites instead of the cattle of the firstborn. And this was done, and it says that there were a discrepancy of 273 firstborn who did not have a levy, and these 273 firstborn who did not have a levy had to redeem themselves through 5 silver coins, which was what is done today at a pidyon bechor, at the redemption of the firstborn. Now, what is the ceremony? What is the ceremony of redeeming the firstborn? Well, you could say the redeeming of the firstborn is a ceremony because the firstborn in Egypt of the Egyptians were smitten, and the firstborn of the Israelites were saved because the God or the angel of God passed over the houses of the Israelites and smote the firstborn of the Egyptians in the 10th plague. But there seems to be something else. This need to redeem the firstborn seems to go deeper than that in the family. The position of the firstborn was such that they were in charge of the larger family. This we know from the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, that the firstborn receives a double portion within the will, because they are supposed to be able to support those in the family who need help. They're sort of like the patron of the family, what in Arabic would be called the extended family, the chamula, as they would say. So this was the job of the firstborn. But in antiquity, the firstborn was also considered something special. It was the first strength of the father and the mother, and therefore there was something special about the firstborn. Therefore, kings, the next king was always the firstborn, unless for some reason the firstborn could not be king, or the king didn't want the firstborn to be, but normally it would be the firstborn. So there was something about the firstborn as a representative of the family. Now, in the book of Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, the story there seems to be a sublinear story of what I would call the fall of the firstborn, where the 7 cases of the firstborn, where we know who more or less was in the family, there seem to be 7 cases where the firstborn is not the one who represents the family, and very often because some type of sin took place to remove the firstborn from their rightly state. And let me just go into this for a moment, and I'll even show you how I sort of put it together in a chart. So we have 7 cases. The first one, of course, is the most obvious one. It's Cain and Abel. So in the story of Cain and Abel, you have the first murder. You also have the first fratricide of a brother killing another brother. And this first murder, of course, the Torah, I would say, emphasizes, because if you remember, before it happens, God turns to Cain. He says, Haloim tetiv se'et. Cain, if you want to be better, you don't have to frown and be so sad and gloomy because I did not receive your offering. Because remember, if you become better, you'll be able to deal with this. If you lo tetiv, and if you cannot better yourself, ameliorate yourself, sin is just at the door, and it could hit you at any time. It's almost like it desires you, but you can overcome it. You can control it. So this is the first case, a case of murder. And because of this case of murder, next son, which is born to Adam and Eve, Seth, Shet, it says that he was born in his image. So Adam and Eve are created in the image of God. And Seth is created in the image of Adam and Eve. So it's sort of like who should have been the firstborn, Cain, loses his status and he becomes the wanderer, Nav, as part of his punishment. And Seth becomes the one who inherits the image, means the one who follows what originally mankind was set out to be. Then the second case are the 3 children of Noah, Shem, Kham, and Yefet. Now they're listed, it's interesting that in the Parsha of Noah, they are listed first as Shem, Kham, and Yefet, the 3 sons. So you would assume that Shem must be the oldest one and Yefet the youngest one. However, we know for certain that Kham was the younger one. Or at least it says about Yefet, Achi Yefet Hagadol. In fact, in one place it talks about Shem and Yefet. But just before I get to this, so it says Shem, Kham, and Yefet, so you assume that Shem was the oldest. However, at the end of Parshat Noach, when they talk about the children of Shem, Kham, and Yefet, they switch the order. Yefet is the first, Kham is the second, Shem is the third that they talk about the children, the offspring. Now you might say, okay, maybe Shem is at the end because after all, we want to eventually come to the story with Avraham, and Avraham is the descendant of Shem. That's possible. However, there's another verse when it's talking about Shem, and it says, Achi Yefet Hagadol, which means the older brother of Yefet. Now, it's true, Rav Sadia Gaon explains that Shem is the older brother of Yefet, which would, of course, match the beginning of Parsha Noach. However, both Rashi and Abraham Ibn Ezra, and actually the Talmud in Sanhedrin 69b, claim the opposite, that Achi Yefet Hagadol, the older brother of Yefet, is to be read, Achi Yefet Hagadol, the brother of Yefet, who is the oldest, meaning Yefet is the oldest. And in fact, Rashi goes on to explain how much older Yefet actually was from Shem and tries to prove this. So Rashi is 100% certain, as it seems that the Talmud is also in Sanhedrin, that Yefet is the older brother. So it's interesting. Cain is the Bechor, and he loses his status, and it becomes Shet instead. Yefet, it appears, was the eldest, but instead Shem is the chain through which eventually Abraham will come, through the descendants of Shem. That's why those who like the descendants of Abraham are called Shemites or Semites, and those who don't like them are called anti-Shemites, right? So Shem, which also means the name, there's a lot to say about that, but Shem becomes the preferred son, even though he's not necessarily the firstborn. Let's keep going. Now, Nachor, who is 9 generations after Noah, and Abraham is the 10th, Nachor has 3 children, and they're listed in this order. Avraham, who at the time was called Avram, he didn't get the Hey, the H, if you want to call it, added to his name at that point, and Nachor and Haran. Now, everybody agrees that Haran was the youngest. The question is, was Avram the oldest? Or is it just like in Shem, Kham, and Yefet, that Shem is mentioned first because he's the important one, they want to tell the story behind him, therefore he's first, but not necessarily the eldest? And maybe here too, it's talking about Avram, Nachor, and Haran because the story will continue talking about Avram. This is also, by the way, a discussion in the Talmud in Sanhedrin 69b. And there are 2 opinions. There are those who say Avram was the oldest, and others say that no, it's not that he was the oldest, it's basically that Avraham was the one that the Torah is about to talk about, so it talks about him first. It's not clear then who is the oldest, but we do know which one of the sons made a problem. And by the way, I should mention this also earlier, I'm sorry. In number 2, Shem, Kham, and Yefet, Kham becomes the preferred son. Now, we don't know if Yefet was the oldest, and there's nothing about Yefet in the story that says that he fell from grace to make there a reason for Shem to take over his place. However, I will mention that among the children of Noach, there is a famous story, of course, that Noach, after the flood, chapter 9, he comes out of the ark, and after the flood is over, so Noach, I guess, cannot deal with the fact that the whole world was destroyed. He feels guilty. And it says that he plants a garden, he plants a vineyard, and he drinks from the wine and gets drunk. And when he gets drunk, he starts dancing naked in his tent. And Kham, his son Kham, sees him and thinks it's very funny and tells his brothers. But his brothers come and clothe their father, walking backwards, not to embarrass him by looking at him. Now, it actually says that when Noach saw what his son did to him, but it doesn't tell us what his son did to him in the text. The Midrash said that there was some type of sexual immorality which Kham and his son Canaan did to Noah, but it's not mentioned in the text. Why am I mentioning it here? Because Shem becomes a preferred son. It could have been even Shem and Yefet. If you remember the blessings that Noah blesses his children. He says, Yaft Elohim b'Yefet v'yishkod bo Shem. May God give beauty to Yefet. It's like a play on words. Yefet is like the term beauty. And may he dwell in the tents of Shem. So it sounds like the preferred sons of Shem and Yefet. And he curses Kham and his son Canaan. So it's obvious that Noah saw that Kham had sinned against him and did not want Kham to be the preferred descendant. And it seems to be almost as if it's Shem and Yefet would be okay, but he says specifically that Yefet should dwell in the tents of Shem. And eventually Shem becomes the preferred line, which becomes the line of Abraham. When I say the preferred line, by the way, I am not talking about something genetic or physical. I'm talking about the ability to carry the burden and the responsibility of a moral life. That's what I mean, which does not go specifically according to the firstborn. Let me continue. With Abraham, Nachor, and Haran, again, Terach, of course, is an idol worshiper, and which probably was not the case with Cain, Abel, Shem, Kham, and Yefet. Now, in the story of the Midrash brings in the Talmud, that Haran was the idol worshiper among them, Abraham was the monotheist who believed in one God, and the other brother, Nachor, was not 100% convinced, so Abraham took him with him, and when Haran, Haran is the idolater. I'm sorry, once more. Nachor is the idolater. Haran is not sure, and Avraham is the monotheist. Avraham, seeing that Haran is not sure, he takes him with him. And when Haran dies, so he takes Lot with him wherever he goes, as long as he can, until there's fallout between Avraham and Lot. So basically, Nachor is the idol worshiper, so Nachor's line has to be redeemed. Avraham's line becomes the preferred line for the moral burden of what God is going to want from humanity. And Avraham, as I explained in Parshat Lech Lecha, and if I didn't do this year, I'll do it next year, becomes the family that Avraham is very interested in redeeming, Haran's family and Nachor's family. So as you probably noticed until now, we have three major sins, which in Judaism are called the three central sins, which is called murder, sexual immorality, and idolatry. Right? So it's shfichut damim, gilui arayot, v'avodah zarah. These are called the three cardinal sins of Judaism. And so in this first three of the seven, we land up, which happens, Cain and Abel, which is the beginning of mankind, the second generation. Shem, Kham, and Yefet, who are the second generation of Noah, right? Cain and Abel, the second generation of Adam and Eve. Shem, Kham, and Yefet are the second generation of Shem, Kham, and Yefet. And Avraham, Nachor, and Haran are the second generation of Terach, but Avraham now becomes a new line. And after Cain and Abel, Shem will be a new line, and then Shem, Kham, and Yefet, Shem will be a new line. In Avram's family, we find three things which mimic the first three, but not exactly. For instance, you have Ishmael and Isaac, where Ishmael is the firstborn of a different woman, of course, but he's from Hagar, but he is the firstborn of Abraham. And before Isaac is born, Abraham even says to God, why can't Ishmael be the one to walk before you? But Isaac is the one that God says is going to be the one who will continue the seed of Abraham. And Ishmael will be his own people. When Sarah requests from Abraham to expel Ishmael and his mother, it says that she saw Ishmael and Isaac misachek, playing. And Rashi says that this is an allusion to the idea of sexual immorality. In other words, she saw Ishmael as being a bad influence on Isaac, and she was afraid that this would push towards sexual immorality, and therefore she requests that will be expelled, something which Abraham didn't want, but God said to listen to Sarah. So here, instead of actually having sexual immorality, it's desired sexual immorality, but it probably didn't actually happen because he was expelled. Same thing happens with Esau and Jacob. Esau is the firstborn of Isaac. In this case, both Esau and Jacob are from the same woman, which is Rebecca, which is Rivka. And interesting thing is also when Jacob, who bought the birthright from Esau, was told by his mother to claim the blessing of Esau, which is a discussion also by itself, which I'm not going to go into. So Esau says, Yikarvu yamei evala avi, when the time comes that my father will pass away, then I'm going to murder Jacob. So he has this desire to murder Jacob, but he actually never carries it out because Jacob goes away to take a wife, meets him 20 years later, and basically it doesn't happen. So here you have, in other words, the attempt of sexual immorality, the attempt of murder, but they actually don't happen. And then in case 6, this is the one which is the much more complicated. On each one, there's more to say, of course, which is the house of Jacob. In the house of Jacob, of course, there are 2 main women, which is Leah and Rachel. Now, Leah has children first. So Leah's first, Reuven, literally should be the Bechor, should be the firstborn. However, Jacob actually wanted to marry Rachel and not Leah. So you could argue that Joseph should be the firstborn because that was the one. It was Laban who tricked him and gave him Leah, and he married Leah, but then he worked another 7 years to be able to marry Rachel, the one he originally wanted. So you can see there could be an argument here between Reuven and Joseph, who the actual firstborn is. In addition, because we notice that when the firstborn falls from grace, like Cain, who was the firstborn and murdered Abel and Seth took over, so this seems to be something which is known. Now, when Shimon and Levi killed the men of the city of Shechem, which happened, of course, because Shechem ben Hamor raped Dinah, their sister. But the way they did it, instead of just trying to save Dinah, but literally killing all the men of the city of Shechem, this got Jacob really angry. And he says, Madua chartemoti lavisheni, why did you embarrass me and give me such a name among all the nations of this land from what you did? And also in the blessings of the end of his life, he says about Shimon and Levi, Klei Hamas macherotehem, they have the weapons of corruption, and I don't want my name to be mentioned among their assemblies. So basically, Shimon and Levi fall from grace, but Reuven first. So Reuven falls from grace first because Reuven, who actually was the firstborn, it says that he slept with Bilhah. Now, even though there's a discussion in the Talmud what that actually means, did it mean that just that he moved the bed from the tent of Jacob after his mother had passed away, or after Rachel had passed away, or does it mean that he actually slept with Bilhah, who was the midwife of Rachel? In other words, he thought that it wasn't wrong. According to the Talmud, he thought it was wrong that Bilhah's bed should be instead of Rachel if Rachel had passed away, because she was just a midwife. But the Torah itself says that he slept with Bilhah, and therefore it was some type of sin that was enough to remove him from the birthright. And Jacob too, when he blesses Reuven at the end of his life, he says, Chilalta yitzui Allah, you have desecrated my bed. So Reuven sinned, Shimon and Levi sinned. Who is left in the actual line of Leah? Judah. That's why Judah and Joseph are the ones who are odds with each other, because each one think they inherited the birthright. Judah thinks that he inherited the birthright from his mother having the firstborn of Jacob. And since Reuven, Shimon, and Levi sinned it should now come to him. And Joseph, being the firstborn of Rachel, says, well, this is the one that my father wanted, so I'm really the firstborn. It was by trickery that Leah actually entered into the family. The argument between Judah and Joseph are very interesting. Rabbi Cook goes into great detail about this, something I'm not going to talk about now. But the argument seems to be between the universalistic concept of Judaism and the particular concept of Judaism. I'll talk about it another time on the book of Genesis. But this argument was so great that each side was afraid that if the other one has their way, it'll be the demise of monotheism the way we know it. And therefore, they had a real fear of idolatry. So here you have, in 4 or 5 of 6, fear that there might be sexual immorality, fear that there might be murder, and a fear that monotheism might turn into idolatry. So it sort of mimics the first 3, but the first 3, it actually happened. And the second 3, it was alluded that it might happen. At this point, it becomes obvious that it is not the firstborn anymore who is the one, even though it's still in the thinking that the firstborn is the one who is carrying, but you can see in each case, the firstborn is not the representative of the family. In the case of Cain, in the case of Shem, Kham, and Yafet, if Yafet was the first, so the one who represents is Shem. Avram, Nachor, and Haran, it's not clear, but definitely Avram was the one who, it's obvious that, by the way, Haran was the youngest. Avraham is the one who is the chosen here. And it's very possible Nachor was the oldest in his family settings because, well, you have to see the way Rashi explains it and the way the Talmud explains it in Sanhedrin. Now, Ishmael and Isaac, also Ishmael is the firstborn, but God says specifically through Isaac, you will have the continuation of your seed. Esav and Jacob, Esav is the firstborn, but Jacob is the one that Rebecca gets the prophecy, Rav Yavod Sair, the older one will be subservient to the younger one. And of course, in Jacob's family, it becomes both Judah and Joseph, by the way, but not the actual Bechor, not the actual firstborn Reuven. But Judah and Joseph both see themselves as the firstborn, and even though they're at odds with each other, they both will actually have a role in the Jewish people, just like they will have a role in the tribes, the 10 tribes versus the 2 tribes, and a role in the land, the northern and the southern kingdom, etc. And then, of course, the last story of the firstborn in the book of Genesis is the sons of Joseph, Menashe and Ephraim. And Menashe is the older one. But when Jacob comes to bless them, and Jacob says to Joseph, look, I didn't even expect to see you, and here God is showing me your children. And so he comes to bless them. And when he blesses them, he crosses his hands and he puts his right hand on the head of Ephraim and his left hand on the head of Menashe. Joseph says, no, Father, it's a mistake. Menashe is the older one. He's the firstborn. And Jacob says, Yadati bini, Yadati, I know this. He will also be an important son, but Ephraim is the one who is going to be the one who will be the great nation. And Ephraim also becomes the central tribe of the northern kingdom. So basically in this book of Breshit, you have a constant switchover from the firstborn, the Bechor, to the chosen, the Nivchar, we would say in Hebrew. It's the switchover from the Bechor to the Nivchar, from the firstborn to the chosen. What is the difference between the firstborn and the chosen? Difference is the firstborn, difference is, of course, that the firstborn is the one that you might say nature imbued with a certain advantage. But it doesn't have to be the spiritual representative of that family. So in the book of Genesis, each time it's obvious that it's not the firstborn who is going to be the spiritual representative of that family. So the firstborn can still receive the double portion in order to support the family economically, but it'll be the nivchar. And this happens specifically in the book of Numbers in this chapter with Bamidbar. Because here, officially now, all the firstborn of the people of Israel are all being replaced by the Levites, because the tribe of Levite was chosen by God as the ones to work in the temple, whether a Levi or a Kohen, but this tribe is going to work in the temple. So they are the chosen ones instead of the firstborn. They are the nivchar instead of the bechor, which is exactly what's happening now to tell you that it's not about the selection of nature, which defines the moral character of a human being. It's who you are and what your struggle is and what you want to reach. And that is the ability to be chosen, and not necessarily what natural selection might have put your way. Now, the tribe of Levi, of course, is chosen by God. But as Maimonides says, each individual in their own lives can follow the idea of the tribe of Levi and try to put themselves on that moral and spiritual path and be a blessing to mankind. Shalom, shalom.